I want to address a little bit two questions that someone sent me, and for one question I have an answer, one question I actually don't have an answer, but I want to share the question because it is a very, very interesting question. This is actually quite a hush of a person. Question number one, which I don't see as tremendously difficult, is that we have a concept in halacha called istanus. Istanus means a person that is fastidious, that he can't stand being a little dirty or being a little sweaty. And we find in Hilchos Avelos and the halachas of the 9 days that if somebody is an istanus who suffers extremely much when they didn't take a bath or didn't take a shower or didn't have a haircut or a shave, so there are certain leniencies even in mourning and even during the 9 days. There's a concept called istanus. Remember, the Mishnah in Bracha says that Rabbi Gamliel bathed on the very day that his wife died because he says he's an istanus, he's permitted to bathe. So the question I was asked is istanus a subjective thing that every single person makes his own judgment, or is there kind of a situation where it has to be a normal thing for people to be extra fussy? I mean, l'chayra, by definition, I think istanus is bedafka not a normal thing, and it is a very, very subjective. So maybe I didn't understand the question, but that was simple, I think. But the more complicated question, which is really a hard question, I mean, it's almost a funny question to ask, what is the definition of Talmud Torah? Let's imagine the following. You open up a page of Gemara, and the Gemara is discussing the path of the sun or the path of the moon, or the Gemara is discussing medical information. The Gemara is discussing what do you do for a stomach ache. And it gives you some type of medical advice. Maybe it's nogeya, maybe it's not nogeya. Are you makayim Talmud Torah when what you're learning in a Gemara is not necessarily what we would call either halacha or even agadata in terms of philosophy, theology, morals, ethics? You're learning Chazal speaking as scientists, as doctors. Are you makayim Talmud Torah that way? Could you make berachas HaTorah if the only Gemara you're going to be learning now is a Gemara that talks about medicine? Now, if you're going to tell me yes, because it's in the Gemara, so let's ask this question. What if I'm learning Maseches Rosh Hashanah? And Maseches Rosh Hashanah talks a lot about astronomy, about the way the moon travels, etc. And I decide that in order for me to understand the Gemara, I need to read a book on astronomy. So I'm going to the library, I go to the internet, and I get a book. Not Torah, whatever, Stephen Hawking, whatever it is. I get a book about astronomy. And I'm learning astronomy, I'm learning anatomy, I'm learning medicine in order for me to understand Chazal. Am I makayim Talmud Torah when I'm doing that? Because after all, I'm doing it not because I'm interested in physics or I'm interested in astronomy, I'm doing it to understand Torah. So does that become a chelik of Talmud Torah? Now, if you're going to tell me, well, it's not really Talmud Torah, it's only a means to understand Torah, but it's not Torah itself, but it's a means, which is still important. Well, then let me ask you, so why would it be a difference if it's in the pages of the Gemara itself? In other words, if the Gemara talks about the way the moon travels, and I look in a book which describes the way the moon travels, what makes one Torah and what makes one not Torah? In other words, you can either take the position that any secular knowledge that helps me understand Torah is a chelik of Talmud Torah, in which case that would be true even if it's from a secular book. Or you can take the position that if it's not talking about a religious issue, it's not Torah, but if that would be so, that should even be true if it's in the Gemara. What is magical about, Chaim Kanievsky, I think, once said, if it's in the Gemara, it's Torah. But the truth is, you have to understand that. What makes something Torah because it's in a particular book? So this is an interesting question. Now again, I want to emphasize, Hakol Moedim, the Vilna Gaon says beferish, that certainly it's important to have a secular knowledge to understand the Torah. That's not our question. You will not understand Maseches Rosh Hashanah if you don't know some basic astronomy. You will not understand Hilchos Kalayim, about planting different plants, unless you understand something about agriculture. That's very true. But the question is that just a means to Torah? Or does that become Torah itself because it's a key. I could give the same thing about the Hebrew language. Diktuk is studying Hebrew or Aramaic. I don't know if we have Aramaic ulpans, but is that a mitzvah? Well, the Rambam says it is a mitzvah, but the question is it a mitzvah of Torah learning, or is it a mitzvah only because it enables Torah learning? So it's a very interesting question. What is Torah for purposes of Talmud Torah? If we're talking about halacha, if we're even talking about mutar, if we're talking about hashkafa, those are the religious ideas that Hashem wants us to absorb. But if we're talking about science, astronomy, medicine, biology, even if they're necessary to understand the Torah, which they are, does that make them Torah or does it not? And if it makes it Torah, then why would it be different if it's from a secular book or from a holy book? I mean, someone asked Rav Chaim Knesset, could you make Birchas HaTorah if all you're learning is the Refuah section in Maseches Gittin? He said yes. So my question is, if I can make Birchas HaTorah on the Refuahs of Maseches Gittin, why can't I make Birchas HaTorah on the Refuahs in whatever it is, some book that talks about how to take care of your health? Because you could also say, well, I'm reading a health book to be Makayim the mitzvah of Nishmartim Od L'Nafsho Seicha, of guarding your health. So I don't have a great answer for this. And the rabbi, I had the question myself, and the rabbi asked me the question. I guess he wanted me to at least explore it in the Q&A, and I actually think it's a bit of a tzorech ian, what is nichlal in Talmud Torah. But now it's your turn. Yeah.
Right, just to add on what you're saying, I remember the Rav maybe once mentioning before that if it's like in like the walls or within the Sefer Torah itself, that it could be that there are deeper like shots within the words that they actually chose to describe whatever medical or engineering or physics behind that. It could be that that's what makes it Talmud Torah.
In other words, when it comes from Chazal, so now we're looking more, not so much the book, but we're looking at the identity of the speaker.
Right.
If the teacher is Chazal, so then we would say that there are many sodos that are gonus in their words that go beyond the scientific data, as opposed to a scientist, at most he's giving you scientific data. That could be. So that would make a point that it depends, are you getting it from a Talmud Chacham? But again, it's very strange. It's a little strange, because sometimes the Talmud Chacham would have gotten it from the secular book. So right, the Talmud Chacham sees a secular medical book and then gives you eitzes. Right? So are we going to say the secular book is not Torah? Once the Talmud Chacham tells you over what it says in the secular book, presumably he'll bring other inyanim in it, and that'll make it Talmud Torah. That would be an interesting possibility. Yeah.
When we understand that in terms of making shidduchim, it's said that when someone makes 3 couples, they get automatic olam haba. This is kind of a 2-part question, but what is the makor for that exact teaching? And secondly, what does it mean to have automatic olam haba? Because it's also said, like, if you say ashrei 3 times a day, you get olam haba. Like, does that mean no gehinnom at all, or what does it mean to be automatic olam haba? And where's the makor for 3?
Yeah. The thing about the 3 shidduchim I actually have not even heard, so I'll try to find out what the makor is. There may be a makor. I'm not dismissing it, but sometimes people just make things up. Frankly, it happens in the world that way. There is an inyan that when you make a shidduch, you're considered to be a creator of a world, because basically every individual, kol makayim nefesh achas miYisrael, if you keep one person alive, it's as if you created a whole world. So when you make a shidduch, you're a borei olam, because you're creating a unit that can now produce, God willing, children. So you are a creator of many, many worlds. Now it could be the svara, I don't know where you get the number 3 exactly, chazaka, but it could be the idea that as you become a creator in the world, you're comparable to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kaviyachol, and therefore you deserve a chelik in olam haba as being connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the second question, indeed, is a hard question. What does it mean you're guaranteed olam haba? It certainly doesn't mean you're guaranteed. Let's say you make 3 shidduchim, but you're an oved avodah zarah. You make 3 shidduchim and you're a rotzeach. you make 3 shidduchim and you're a kaifer in the Yud Gimel Hikrei Emunah. You're not going to get Olam Haba in light of those other things. But what it does mean, it's guaranteed, meaning to say, if you have no factors that would take it away, this is enough to meet the minimum qualifications of Olam Haba. Meaning, this gets you an admission ticket, but the admission ticket can be forfeited for misbehavior. I look at it that way. So that doesn't give you a free pass to engage in all of the Averas, but it does give you a Zechiyah. Now, it's interesting, it's not connected to your question, but the Rambam says in the Parish of Mishnayos, in Maseches Makkos, this is a famous Maimer Chazal that I know you've heard, and whenever we want to say a Kaddish Rabbanan in Agadata, we always add, after a Gemara share, we always add, Rabbi Chananya ben Akashya, right? You've heard this. Rabbi Chananya ben Akashya said, Ratza Kadosh Baruch Hu lizakais es Yisrael lefichach hirbe lahem Torah u'mitzvahs. Hashem wanted to confer merit on Bnei Yisrael, therefore he gave them a lot of Torah and mitzvahs. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Hashem chafetz l'man tzidkai. Hashem desires tzidkai, to make us righteous. Yagdil Torah, he made the Torah big, v'yadir, and mighty. So what is Rav Chananya ben Akashya saying? HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted us to have zechusim, so he gave us many mitzvahs. What's the kesher? Fakert. Maybe I'd have more zechusim with fewer mitzvahs. If I had fewer things, I could do them. Now I could mess up. So the Rambam says a very interesting yesod. It's an amazing yesod, and he does not say it in the Mishnah Torah. He says, if a person does one mitzvah in his life one time, with total kavanah l'shem shamayim, that will guarantee him admission to Olam Haba. Now, it's very, very hard. I mean, that sounds easy, but maybe it's not so easy. One mitzvah in your life, that's totally for God. Now, different people get aroused emotionally by different things. So Hashem gave us many, beautiful pshat, many different types of mitzvahs. So the probability is each person, once in his life, will be totally l'shem shamayim. You see, if Hashem would have given us one mitzvah of tefillin, so let's say I wear tefillin, Baruch Hashem, but maybe tefillin doesn't speak to me so much. So Hashem gives you a variety, a smorgasbord. And by giving you a smorgasbord, so some people like tzedakah, and some people like tefillin, and some people like Kriya Shema, and some people like Shabbos. What is Hashem doing? He's maximizing the probability that there'll be one mitzvah that you're going to do l'shem shamayim. But even there too, what does the Rambam mean? So I did one mitzvah in my life, l'shem shamayim, I get Olam Haba, no matter what else I do. No, I could lose it by Averas. But the point the Rambam is making is, the admission ticket, the cost of admission, is one mitzvah totally l'shem shamayim. And again, that is not as easy as it may sound, as a matter of fact. But that's the idea of you're guaranteed a chelik and Olam Haba. Yeah.
So isn't that tefillin is bracha Moshe Sinai?
What is it?
Tefillin is bracha Moshe Sinai.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how it happened that Ashkenazim do it inwards as far as do it outwards, and the patterns are different, and Kabbalah is a big and small. How did all these changes occur?
Yeah. So you have to understand. I mean, first of all, tefillin as a mitzvah is actually in the Chumash, obviously, but many of the halachas of tefillin, like it's square, it's black. Right, these are halacha l'Moshe Sinai. You are correct. Many halacha l'Moshe Sinai are tefillin. That's the largest single area of halacha. That's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So you're asking, well, if halacha l'Moshe Sinai, Hashem gave Moshe the laws, then how could there be differences? So in terms of the ritzuas, that is not such a difficult point, because the emes is like this. The emes is the chiyuv of tefillin de'oraisa does not require wrapping ritzuas around your arm at all. Or even wrapping it once would be good. The Torah simply says you tie the box of the tefillin on your arm and you put it on your head. There is no halacha that your arm, your forearm, has to be involved at all. And for example, if you didn't do 7 ritzuas, you would vaday be yaitse the mitzvah. So since the whole idea of ritzuas is really al pi Kabbalah, and it represents the lower 7 spheres, etc. So the reasons are really Kabbalistic, in to out or out to in, but it's not a stira. Whatever it is not a stira to halacha l'Moshe Sinai, because there is no halacha l'Moshe Sinai l'gabi ritzuas. Now, if you do want to ask me a kasha, you can ask me a kasha which I don't have a great answer, and that is, okay, ritzuas can be this way, that way, because that's not part of the halacha anyway, and if you didn't even put the ritzuas, the tefillin would be kosher, and certainly the size of the bias is certainly nothing to do with anything. Let me just point out, there's a maila and a chisaron. There is a maila to big, and there's a maila to small. The maila of big is that the bigger the parshios, the easier it is to write them halachically proper. When parshios are very small, same thing with the mezuzah. It's very hard for the sefer to write it without letters touching. And if the letters are touching, the whole thing is puzzle. So the maila of big is that probably the parshios are going to be in better shape. The chisaron of big is if it's too big, the tefillin are not in the right part of the head or the arm. This is a big problem with bar mitzvah boys who haven't grown up yet, right? The bar mitzvah boys might sometimes be very, very small, and they got these gigantic tefillin that, takes up, 2/3 of their arm, and that's a big problem because the tefillin can't be below the height, the highest point of the bicep, right? So that's why small is better than big in terms of positioning tefillin. Now, there has been a solution, which is not widely followed, but it's very, very interesting, which addresses both of these issues, where you can get both small and big at the same time, and that is, but instead of having your tefillin as a perfect square, you have it in which it's very small in terms of length and width, but it's high like a stovepipe hat, like an Abe Lincoln hat, in the sense that tefillin does not have to be a cube. A cube is length, width, and height are the same, and most of our tefillin are square. That's how tefillin are normally made, but the halacha does not require that tefillin be square. It does require, be cube rather. It does require the length and the width be equal, so it does require a square base, but it does not require that the height be the same. So when you have, I don't know if you've ever seen this, they actually sell them. These are high tefillin. They're small and they're high, and that way you have room to stick in big parshios. And it makes a lot of sense because this way you have a small base which fits on your head and on your bicep, but you have enough room in the bias to put in a big parsha. It looks funny, it's not common, but a number of great gedolim have endorsed the concept of the stovepipe tefillin. Now, your kasha about ritzuas or big, small is not really a big deal. But where you have a real big deal is Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. That is a real, real problem. We know that the tefillin have to have 4 parshios. Shema v'hayam shamoa, and Kadesh v'haya ki yiviyacha in Parshas Bo. The parshios have to be in a certain order. In the tefillin shel Reish, there are 4 separate parshios. Tefillin shel Yad is one big parchment, but still the parshios have to be written in a certain order. Machloket, now, if they're not written in the right order, the tefillin, or placed in the right order, not so much written, but placed in the right order, let's say in the rosh, the tefillin are puzzle. They're puzzle b'di'evet. There's a machlokes Rashi and his own grandson, Rabbeinu Tam, about what is the order of the parshios in the tefillin. Now, obviously, halachically, we do paskin like Rashi, and that is why Rabbeinu Tam is considered to be a chumrah, right? So everybody davens with Rashi's tefillin. Many Hasidim and Anshe Maisa will put on Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin afterwards, for Ashrei, after Chazaras Hashatz. Some Sephardim actually wear both tefillin. They wear, I don't know if you ever saw this, but that requires small tefillin. They wear 2 pairs of tefillin at the same time, Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. But it's a davar pashut. If you only could afford 1 pair of tefillin, there is no question, lahalacha, that you would go with Rashi. I mean, that's pashut. But the big question is, how could such a thing happen? Because if you're dealing with a chumrah, some cities did it this way and some cities did it this way, all right. So either way, the tefillin are kosher. But Could it be that people forgot? I mean, according to Rabbeinu Tam, his own Zaidi was not Yotzei Tefillin. Very strange. I mean, I shouldn't say it this way. I mean, the Gemara says that if a person went through his whole life without putting on tefillin, he can't get Olami Habo. If it's that's why Chabad makes a whole point, once in your life putting on tefillin. According to Rabbeinu Tam, did Rashi ever wear kosher tefillin in his life? Unless he put on Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin once, or whatever it is. So there you have a real big question. Did Rabbeinu Tam just get up one day and decide that the whole world is wearing pasuk tefillin? So that's a real question. How did that get introduced? Meaning many other issues are minhagim, many other issues are chumras, so memela that could be different. But here you have a real problem in which type of tefillin. Now it is borer, people say, that Rabbeinu Tam himself was not mechadesh this on his own, and in fact in the Yerushalmi there are makayra, so apparently there were two minhagim in Klal Yisrael from a very early time. Okay, but even if we say it's not from Rabbeinu Tam, it's much, much earlier, you're still going to have a problem. How does such an uncertainty get introduced in a mitzvah that people are supposed to keep every day? I mean, as soon as somebody does it wrong, that should have been corrected right away. So that is a very, very difficult kasha. So Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi is a difficult machlekes to understand how that uncertainty came in. But the other ones are not so bad. Yeah. I'm back.
You mentioned what I did previously a while back about thinking again. You mentioned how the cipher was not that had olive oil throughout. On the industrial, they'll have a kind of need that you didn't enjoy from the pleasure of this world. So I wanted to know what are like the parameters of that? Because you need to make sure they go bungee jumping, what are they going to have a kind on you that you didn't enjoy the pleasure?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, obviously, a person is not supposed to bedafka be rodef every single type of amusement in the world. Although I've heard kids use this against their parents. Sometimes they go to an amusement park or something, and Abba and Ima want to go home already, and the kid says, "Well, the Yerushalmi says you got to let me go on that roller coaster, one more time. Otherwise, there'll be a taina." Chazal don't mean every single one. Really, Chazal are expressing the idea that one should not despise the pleasures of the world because they are a way of fostering gratitude. But they don't mean with dafki you got to seek out every single thing. Although I think I did quote B'Shas Ma'isa, Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who said Hashem is going to ask us after 120 years if we enjoyed the Alps, because the Alps are so grand, has so much grandeur and the like. Because Hashem says, "Oh, you didn't enjoy my Alps. I put them there so you would see the greatness of my creation." But of course, Rav Hirsch lived near the Alps, right? He was in Germany. It wouldn't be the same as us. By the way, a very, very interesting story, just apropos of natural wonders. There are brachas that you recite when you see amazing mountains. Eretz Yisrael does not have amazing mountains like that, but when you see the Alps, the Himalayas, there are brachas, Isa Maisa Brachas. So there is a bracha, the Mishnah says, when you see the Yam Hagadol. When you see the Yam Hagadol, right, there's a bracha, a special bracha, Yam Hagadol. So there's a machlekes hapaiskim. Is Yam Hagadol the Mediterranean, or is Yam Hagadol the Atlantic? And because of this, Safek bracha slahakel, Safek bracha we don't make a bracha, so when I see the Mediterranean I don't make a bracha, and when I fly over the Atlantic I don't make a bracha. Because each one is a Safek bracha, what were Chazal masakin it on? But there's one place in the world where you see the Atlantic and the Mediterranean at the same time, so you vadai make the bracha, and that's the Straits of Gibraltar. The Straits of Gibraltar, it's in Spain and North Africa, right? Gibraltar, right? That's where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic Ocean. So if you see the Straits of Gibraltar, you taka make the bracha of Yam Hagadol. So Gibraltar, by the way, has a frum community. Not only that, I believe every Jew in Gibraltar is frum. I mean, Gibraltar is like 100. You don't even have that in Bnei Brak. Gibraltar is like 100% frum community. And but again, it's not so learned. So Rav Steinman, Zechronu Livracha, would sometimes visit Gibraltar to give them chizuk. So when they're flying to Gibraltar, his entourage is really, really excited because they see the Strait of Gibraltar and they can make the bracha of Yam Hagadol. So Rosh Steinman is learning, and they go to Rosh Steinman and say, Rebbe, you can make the bracha. So Rosh Steinman says, I'm learning right now. What are you bothering me? He says, make a bracha. He says, I'm not mechuyev to look at the Straits of Gibraltar to make a bracha. If I see it, I make a bracha. But my learning is more important. I mean, why should I be mevatel Torah to make the bracha of Yam Hagadol? So again, it was an interesting priority. It reminds me of a similar story, somewhat similar, that sometimes in Yerushalmi, Baruch Hashem, people try to reclaim mitzvahs that have been dormant for a very long time. So one of the unusual mitzvahs that people are trying to reclaim is the mitzvah of pidyon peter chamor. What is pidyon peter chamor? That if you own a donkey, a female donkey, and the donkey gives birth to a firstborn male donkey, you redeem the donkey on a sheep. It's not a korban. And you give the sheep to a kohen. Now, not too many people ever get to do that mitzvah, right? So now there's a thing where some people, like some Avreichim, they'll buy a donkey that never gave birth before, so they'll be Makayim Pidyon Peter Chamor. In fact, I know a guy in Detroit. I mean, he made a little career out of this. He arranges, because apparently he has a way, people want to do this. Like he arranges getting you a donkey, and he arranges, and he's a lawyer. He told me it's quite complicated because interstate movement of livestock requires permits and licenses. So like for a fee, like he'll get the licenses for you and then transport the donkey. And he says he's done like 30 of them in the United States over 5 years. But it started in Eretz Yisrael. It started, I think, maybe 30 years ago. Kikar Shabbat did it. They had one, and like 10,000 people came. Pidyon Peter Chamor. Like, who's ever seen a Pidyon Peter Chamor? Now it's a little more common, actually. So somebody went to Rabbi Yosef and asked the Shaila. He wanted to take off morning seder to go see a Pidyon Peter Chamor. He says, is it mutar to take off or such a thing? He says, Rabbi Yosef just looked at him like he was absolutely insane, and then went back to the gemara. He says, what, I mean, there's no Indian. I have to see a Pidyon Peter Chamor. But okay, the seder. But that's an example of mitzvahs that are sometimes neglected that one should try to do. Yeah.
Here's a send-in. It's well known that what people are searching for in this generation is authenticity and authentic experience. Then why is it we always hear that in Kiruv we must offer fancy trips and gourmet food to draw people in, since fancy gashmias is not really authentic Torah Judaism?
Excellent question. If people are looking for authenticity, then why do we do so many things that are inauthentic? The answer basically is that maybe I think your first premise might be a little over-optimistic, meaning we actually live in a fairly materialistic age. And again, I don't mean to put anyone down, but we live in a world where we're used to certain comforts. We're used to certain things that at one point in our existence might have been luxuries, but now it's a necessity. I can't live without air conditioning, for example. So it's not that people are not spiritual. It's not that people are not looking for the truth. Again, we're assuming people are looking for the truth. But the taivas and the standard of living is so powerful that unless you kind of feed the body is not going to let the neshama experience all of that kedusha. So it's not a gimmick. I mean, there are gimmicks in Kiruv. That is very true, but that's maybe a talk for another question. But this is not a gimmick, but this is trying to create an atmosphere where a person feels physically more comfortable and physically more relaxed, and then their neshama is open. Now remember, we actually learned this in the Shemaina Prakim of the Rambam. If you remember, the Rambam in Perek Hey talked about the role of beauty and comfort in Avodas Hashem. And he said that when a person is tense and a person is uncomfortable, their mind does not function as well. So the comfort, including beauty and art and all those things, relax a person. And when a person is in a state of relaxation, so to speak, meaning, I don't mean relaxation, lying down. I mean relaxation in the sense of not being anxious, not being tense. A person feels a little looser. So I think maybe that's what's going on, meaning I wouldn't call it a gimmick and I wouldn't even call it inauthentic, but I think it's unfortunately, and I include myself, we've all become spoiled. And as a result, when we're not comfortable, when we're not sleeping, when we don't have a good bed and the food is no good, it's a little harder. Sometimes it's a little harder for us to concentrate on Avodas Hashem. So really it's a concession to the Yetzer Hara that, at least according to the Rambam, is actually sometimes necessary. Now, people do say, that the Baal Tshuva population, or the potential Baal Tshuva population of 2020 is different than the 1970s. In the 1970s, we had backpackers, and we had hippies, and we had people who would sleep on the ground, and they even enjoyed that, and they roughed it, and the like, and that was part of the experience. That doesn't necessarily work today because the kufos change, and people change, and people's needs change. And I think a responsible Makarev tries to adapt to what people need. Now, there's another important lesson, though. Let me give you an example. Maybe I shouldn't. I'll give you an example. We have in our Sameach, we have our well-beloved mentors mission. Now, the mentors, Baruch Hashem, do a lot of good for the yeshiva. But what is the idea of the mentors? Well, there's a lot of ideas. I'm going to give you one idea, and I'm going to get criticized for this. But part of the idea of mentors is, and this may sound really crass, but I'm going to say it, is we got to show people you can be rich and frum at the same time. We got to show them, because they come to Eretz Yisrael and they meet rabbis and they like a lot of the rabbis, but everybody's like poor. Everybody, doesn't really have a big house or a car or whatever it is. So essentially what the visitor absorbs is, it's beautiful to be from, beautiful family, Torah's beautiful, but that means you got to be poor and you got to live without a car and without air conditioning. I just can't do it. So we bring in our beautiful mentors who are from and learned and mainly rich, and that serves a function. Again, they're much more than that. God forbid. They are much more than that, but they also happen to be rich. I'm going to get in trouble for this, but the point is that actually serves an important function, because that tells a person that to become a Ben Torah and to become frum, you don't have to take a vow of poverty. You can still live a life of professional accomplishment. And that's an important lesson, because there are a lot of guys who are sitting on the fence that if they had to make a choice between giving up professional advancement and everything else or taking on religion, they would have this real problem. But the mentors show us that it's possible to kind of have both. So that is another feature in why we want to create a comfortable environment. We show, becoming a Ben Torah doesn't mean you're going to have to starve to death and not have a bed to sleep on. And that's an important lesson, too. That is an important lesson. Yeah.
So in the Masechet Tani, there's a sugya which compares Moshe, Joshua, and I forget what the third person's name is, but all of them are equivalent in that they have this nates done for them, that the sun and the moon stop them. And it's actually in this parsha that Rashi says that because of some battle that Moshe had the sun stop for them, and so they're all equated through that. But in Yoshua, in Sefer Yoshua, it says that this thing that happened for him never happened before and will never happen again. And so it seems like a steer in both directions. Right.
So the third person you're talking about, was around the time of the Chorban Beis Hamikdash. This is Nakdimon Ben Gurion, I think. That's the one, I believe. Not related to David Ben Gurion. And Nakdimon Gurion was about Staka, and he had borrowed a huge amount of, he had borrowed water to give to the poor, but the condition was he had to restore the water by a certain time, and it wasn't raining yet, and he only had till the end of the day, and the day was extended to allow the cisterns to be full. So that was a tremendous nace, that he was zocheh, that the day was prolonged, just like for Moshe and Yehoshua. But you are correct that the Gemara in Avodah Zarah explains that the singularity of Yehoshua's thing was not that the sun stopped, whatever that even means scientifically, because it stopped for Moshe and it stopped for Nachdim and Ben Gurion, but rather it referred to the length of it. It was 24 hours or 48 hours. The Gemara gives very, very different durations, and the uniqueness was the duration, and that indeed was unparalleled, both in Moshe's time and in Nachdim and Ben Gurion's time. Nachdim and Ben Gurion was essentially, I don't remember if the Gemara tells us, but I think it may have only been less than an hour, which was not that much of a long time. It just required the time to let the rain fill up the cisterns and the like. So that's Yehoshua's thing. Yeah.
This is a second question. Would the Rav be able to explain the differing opinions on taking in early Shabbats?
Yeah. So this is an interesting issue, the issue of taking on an early Shabbos. Those of you that come from the United States, I guess almost everybody, knows that American synagogues, modern Orthodox for sure, and even yeshivish minyanim, the minhag in America is during the summer when Shabbos is late, that people take on an early Shabbos. In Eretz Yisrael, the minhag had been bedafka not to do that, but in recent years, Americans have brought those American minhagim to Eretz Yisrael, and now in American minyanim, like Ramat Eshkol, other places, we all of a sudden find this concept of early Shabbos that is really a foreign imposition onto the minhagim of Eretz Yisrael. So first, let me talk about if you do an early Shabbos, what are the problems? Then we'll see whether you should do an early Shabbos. So first of all, how early can you be Makabel Shabbos? I mean, can I be Makabel Shabbos now? It's a Wednesday. No, I can't. I can't make the whole week Shabbos. So the rule basically is, you could be Makabel Shabbos from Plag HaMincha on Friday. You could be Makabel Shabbos Plag HaMincha. Now, what is Plag HaMincha? Plag HaMincha, it's machokas how to compute it, but I'll go with the standard way of doing it, it is an hour and a quarter sha'os zamanios before shkia. So, which means you compute the number of minutes from sunrise to sunset, divide it by 12, and that is your halachic hour, sunrise to sunset. A halachic hour in the winter can be as short as 45 minutes. A halachic hour in the summer can be as long as 72 minutes. I think that's kind of the range, between 45 and 72. Once you've computed your halachic hour in terms of minutes, you then do 1 4 of those units minus shkia, and that is a period called Plag HaMincha. You can be Makabel Shabbos from Plag HaMincha onwards, including candle lighting. You cannot be Makabel Shabbos before Plag HaMincha. So the first thing you got to know is that your Kabbalah Shabbos, now how are you Makabel Shabbos? So typically if you're davening, you're Makabel Shabbos by either Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbos or Boi B'Shalom, the last stanza of L'cha Dodi, is considered to be Kabbalah Shabbos and the like. If you didn't do Kabbalah Shabbos, when you answer Borchu with Kavana, that's Makabel Shabbos. That's the first point to keep in mind. Now, second point to keep in mind is a rule, and by the way, Plag HaMincha is also the earliest you can daven Ma'ariv. You can daven Ma'ariv, Plag HaMincha, although you're going to have to say Shema over again after Tzeisak Chavim, after the stars come out. Now, problem number 2 is that we have a general rule called Tarti Desasri, that you're not allowed to treat a time period in a contradictory way. Meaning, if I'm treating the period after Plag, Ki'ilu it's night, I can't also treat it as it's day. Which means, as a general rule, if you daven Mincha after Plag, you cannot daven Ma'ariv. You could be Makabel Shabbos technically, but you could not daven Ma'ariv until after Shkia, or maybe even after Tzeis, because otherwise you would be a Tarti Desasri. So, optimally, if you want to do an early Shabbos, what you want to do is you want to daven Mincha before Plag HaMincha, and then Kabbalah, Shabbos, and Ma'ariv after Plag HaMincha. And then, even if you get home before Shkia, you could then, this is the minhag of people, you make Kiddush, you have your Seudah, and when it's Tzeisa Kechavim, under those circumstances, you say Kriya Shema over again. Okay, that is how an early Shabbos works. Mincha before Plag, Ma'ariv Kabbalah Shabbos after Plag, Kiddush, if you follow this shita, can be made before Shkia. In fact, even benching could be, you can finish those Suda, and Kriya Shema after Tzeis. Now, there are some problems here, and that is, I remember when I was a law student, and I spent many, many Shabboses with the Boston Rebbe, Zechrano Livracha, that's the father of the Boston Rebbe who lives here, Reb Meir Horowitz. In fact, I remember Reb Meir Horowitz before he was a Rebbe, because I remember him from when his father was the Rebbe. The Boston Rebbe used to have in Boston, well, Brookline, he used to have 100 people for Shabbos. And I remember that there was a mad rush, like after Ma'ariv, there was a mad rush sometimes to get upstairs, get your seat, and wash. And the reason is because Hasidim have a thing that they don't make Kiddush between 6 and 7. Because it's a bad mazel, it's the mazel of Mars, the red planet, and it's a bad time to make Kiddush. So if davening was over 10 to 6, we had to get to Kiddush really, really, really fast. Because if we didn't make Kiddush before 6 o'clock, it would be an hour wait. And often davening was finished 3 minutes before 6. If you were in the way, you would get run over by a stampede, as it were. Now, Baruch Hashem, most of us are not worried about that, but there is another thing you do have to be worried about, and that is you're not allowed to start a Seudah within a half an hour of Zman Kriya Shema. Okay? Therefore, what that means is the following. If Zman Kriya Shema is Seisa Kechavim, then you're going to have to be sure that you made Kiddush more than a half an hour before Seisa Kechavim, because once you hit that half an hour, you're going to have to wait a half an hour and say Shema before you can make Kiddush. So that's something to be zoyer about. So in a sense, the earlier the better in that way, because you want to make Kiddush before you end. By the way, that half an hour is not Zamanias. That's a 30-minute half hour. That's a fixed half hour. So you want to be sure that you make Kiddush before the half an hour before Zman Kriya Shema. Otherwise, you're going to have to wait. Okay, now, I had mentioned that in Eretz Yisrael, the minhag is not to make an early Shabbos. Now let me explain the problem. And this is based on the psak of Mamish Gedolim. This is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Elyashiv. We're not in favor of an early Shabbos. But let me explain the issue. They were certainly not against accepting Shabbos early. That's a Davar Pashut. You could be Makabel Shabbos by Plak HaMincha. They did say, L'chatchila, it's better to daven Ma'ariv Bisman. So that way, your Yaitse Kriya Shema together with Birchas Kriya Shema. Okay, that's one issue, that they were not in favor of early Ma'arivs. But the second issue is, there's a real machlokes about Kiddush, because obviously, the reason people accept Shabbos early is because they want to eat dinner early. I mean, that's really the purpose. They say for the children or whatever it would be. And here is where you have the problem, because Rav Elyashiv maintained that even though you could be Makabel Shabbos early, and even if you can daven Ma'ariv early, it's not shaykh to make Kiddush early, because Kiddush is a mitzvah d'oraisa, and a mitzvah d'oraisa must be Mekoyim when it is night, and you can't use Tosefes Shabbos to fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa of Kiddush. And therefore, the main halachic issue was, are you allowed to make Kiddush before it is nightfall? It is not a problem of the Etzem Kabbalah Shabbos. And it's not a problem of even davening Ma'ariv, although that's not a lechatchila, but a vadi your yaitse. But the problem is Kiddush. And because of this, Rav Elyashiv and Rav Shlomo Zalman were not in favor of making Kiddush before Tzeisa Kechavim, which means, in effect, you don't gain that much by an early Shabbos. Now, Americans, I have nothing against Americans, some of my best friends are Americans, but Americans always want to bring their minhagim to wherever they go, so they brought this American thing about an early Shabbos, but Itaka was not the minhag of Eretz Yisrael, because of the problem of kiddush. So that's really the main shaila. Yeah.
Here's an alumnus question. These days, there are often discounts given by insurance companies to women, and the gender is defined by what the insured person states the gender is. So would it be mutar for a biological man to say he identifies as a woman in order to pay a smaller premium?
Now, is he doing it only to pay a lower premium, or does he really identify? I mean,
only to get a cheaper.
just I see. Okay. Yeah. Well, first of all, this whole policy is indicative of the absolute insanity that has grabbed hold of the world. There's even a fellow who made a documentary, I think I may have mentioned this, called "What is a Woman?" And he's against all the transgender stuff, and he goes around interviewing people. What is the definition of a woman? And he's talking to these gender studies professors who basically say, well, a woman is anyone that says they are a woman. What do you want? There's no definition. So he asked back, yeshivish a question, but what are they saying they are? They say they're a woman. What do they mean? What are they defining themselves as? And the gender studies guy says, oh, are you being hostile? Whatever it is, microaggression, whatever. So it's a real mishugas that you would think in life there are some things that are relatively simple. Now, I'm not addressing people who are genuinely struggling with the gender dysphoria. There is such a phenomenon, but the world has gone way beyond that, in which everybody can define themselves as whatever they want. So the question that you're asking is a monistic question. If I am identifiably a man, but if I say I regard myself as a woman, I'm going to get a discount. Am I allowed to define myself as a woman to get the discount? Or, since I don't consider myself a woman, am I lying? That's going to be the question. Is it sheker to take advantage of that mishugas policy? It's a good shaila, but I would say it is sheker because lemaisa, the guy is giving you a discount based on his assumption that this is how you truly identify yourself. And if you don't truly identify yourself this way, then you're getting this financial benefit under a false pretense. So I think it would be nichlal in Gneva Stas, even though the guy sees that you're a man either way, but he's doing this based on his assumption of what is your inner perception of your reality, and that isn't your inner perception of your reality. So I think, number one, there is a problem of Gneva Stas. That's one issue. I think there may be a larger issue, although I can't put my finger on what the halachic category is, and that is, by identifying yourself as a woman, you're playing into the societal structure that is totally a matter of self-definition and does not have an objective reality. And in a sense, one could even say, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but this could even say, this is a repudiation of the Torah, essentially. For you to say, I am a woman, it's not just a question of you're fooling the individual merchant. It's you're making a statement that the Torah's definitions of gender are not true definitions. And that is a serious thing. That is what we would call a ziyuf. That is a falsification of the Torah. The Marshal, famous Marshal, Rav Moshe says we don't paskin like the Marshal, but the Marshal says that even though you're allowed to transgress the Torah, if your life is at stake, other than the three sins of Avodah Zarah, Gila Rai, Shvichas Damim, you're not allowed to falsify the Torah, even if you would be killed. You have to give your life before you declare something, an idea, that is against the Torah, falsified in the Torah. That's called a ziyuf haTorah. An example would be, let's say you just read a gemara, how something like you could kill a guy or whatever statement, and the guy asks you, what does that line say? And you don't want to say that because you'll get in trouble. Says you're not allowed to lie. You have to say what that line says. Now that's the Marshal. Ziyuf haTorah is Yehareg V'al Yavor. Rav Moshe says we don't paskin like the Marshal, so I'm not saying it as a halacha, but the seriousness of Ziyuf haTorah I think is a biggie, and you understand that for me to say I'm a woman is a little close in this day and age to a Ziyaf HaTorah. But Gnei Vastas, I think, would be a simpler answer. Yeah.
I want to know if the law previously explained the Jewish approach to machlokes as how two opposite statements could both be true.
Yeah, how can two opposite statements be true? So there are a lot of ways of understanding it. Let me give you two very quick ways of understanding it. Answer number one, we can call the process method. By that to say, Hashem gave Moshe Rabbeinu a methodology for interpreting the Torah. We call it the 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael. He then said, the Chachamim of every generation are authorized to utilize this methodology. As long as they use the methodology and are qualified to be Chachamim, whatever result they come up with is acceptable to me. It's like it's like a math professor giving you full credit for process, even if you don't have the right answer. So in that sense, it's not that Hashem said A or Hashem said B. Hashem left it to the Chachamim to apply the methodologies, and whatever they come up with, Hashem says, good enough. You followed the process. Therefore, your results will be treated as emes in the eyes of God. It may not be objectively true. It may not be Hashem's answer. But Hashem says, on earth, either answer gets full credit. That's one approach. And this is based on the Drushas Haran. There is a second Nakuda that the Vilna Gaon says, which is a little different. He says it may very well be that in a machlokas, one is right and one is wrong, although we don't know which one. But there will always be something in the wrong opinion that will find its expression in some other area of Torah. And this we actually find. If you study Gemara, you'll often find that a certain svara surfaces in a sugya, and then you'll find that same svara will come up in a totally different area. A svara in the laws of karbanos may wind up being relevant in kashrus, or Shabbos, or erevin. And sometimes it's specifically the svara that was rejected in that context, kind of pops up somewhere else. So the notion of both of them being true doesn't mean they'll both be true in the same area, but there'll be a kernel of truth that will pop up in another area. Right, so those are two different mahalchim, the Drushas Haran and the Gra. Yeah.
In regard to Tuba, sometimes, I just want to know, I guess, how we understand that Gemara, especially like in light of, I guess, like nowadays, things are on a completely different thing.
Yeah.
Like, it seems to me there's a huge gap between what Chazal tell us and what we're noting nowadays.
Yep.
In regard to that, I just want to know, I guess.
Yeah. So it's a little premature, but we're coming up after Tisha B'Av, the seventh day from Tisha B'Av. This year, the sixth day is going to be the 15th of Av, and the 15th of Av was the happiest day of the year, and there's a lot of reasons for it. Well, maybe we'll talk about it when we get to Tu B'Av. But one of the great celebrations of Tu B'Av, it was what's called Sadie Hawkins Day, in which people who needed a shidduch, like the women would dress up and dance and parade in front of the men, and the men would choose the right shidduch, etc. And this was a great, great simcha because marriages were made based on these processions. Now, granted, it does mention that all the women borrowed clothing, so rich ones shouldn't dress better than poor ones. Everybody should dress the same, but still, it was kind of an open parade of women. Now, you have to be honest here. Let's imagine there was no such thing as Tu B'Av, but some shadchan proposed this type of ceremony. He said, I have a great idea. We're going to go to Gan Soccer, and we're going to bring 500 girls, dress up, and they're going to parade and dance in front of the men, and the men will go up to the women and choose which one they want to marry. How about it? Go to the Moed Katon Torah and says, this is my idea for the shidduch crisis. Well, the guy's going to be put in either institutionalized or the guy's going to be put in cherem. What are you talking about? Are you crazy? And yet, as I state in the Mishnah, this was what they did. This is what Chazal enacted. This is what Chazal practiced. And this was not a day of shame or humiliation. This was a day of simcha, a day of joy. So what changed? Are we firmer? Are we firmer than Chazal? I don't think so, right? So what changed in which Chazal, I'm just repeating your question, in which Chazal, encouraged this practice and loved this practice, and we would consider it to be like the trafest thing that one could imagine. The truth of the matter is, standards do change, and they change sometimes because, this could be right or wrong. I'm not even defending it, but it's a mitzias that when the world gets more and more and more and more decadent, we sometimes have to go to the other extreme. That's why people are stricter on inyonim of separation of men and women than used to be the case, because we live in a hypersexual environment. We live in an environment where tznius is totally destroyed. The Gemara says beferish. Rabbi Yochanan says in Baba Basra, when I was a young man, I remember how boys and girls, like teenagers, would hold hands walking down the street. A pella. But what he's saying is that when there was a purer atmosphere, boys and girls could be friends. They could be friends. They could be social friends. They could even hold hands because nothing bad would happen. Today, it gets harder and harder. So in reality, all of us are victimized by the corrosiveness and the immorality of the world. So we become more insular. We become more circle the wagons. We got to become more protective. We got to become stricter. Maybe there's a loss here. And the truth of the matter is, I've seen these chilukim even within my own life. I can tell you that 50 years ago, there were even great Rosh Hashivas who had mixed seating at the weddings of their children. Not mixed dancing. Mixed dancing is a separate thing, but mixed seating. Husbands and wives would sit at the same table. Now, except in very modern Orthodox kehilos, that is really not done today. Even in the Hasidic world, never, but that was even then. But among the Litvische, Yeshivische world, mixed seating was a normal phenomenon. It is no longer a normal phenomenon. So the question is, why are we stricter than our grandparents? The answer is because the world is a lot worse than it was in the time of our grandparents. And when the world gets worse, we got to be a little stricter. But it is quite amazing. And by the way, I'll give you another example. The Gemara in Moed Katon, the Mishnah in Moed Katon says beferish, women used to sing at funerals. You can't deny it. It talks about women singing. They sang in chorus. They sang in solo. They were ma'ira people to crying at Levias, etc. What happened to Kol Isha? A woman is singing at a funeral? So you're going to give me terutzim, it's only, the Gemara doesn't say this, but people, if your state it was only women to women. Well, the Gemara doesn't say that. That's like the old joke, how do you know Yaakov Avinu wore a yarmulke? So the raya is, because it says, Vayetze Yaakov left his home. He certainly wouldn't have left without a yarmulke. That's pashut. So of course, it's a raya he wore a yarmulke. You're assuming something. You're assuming women can't sing in front of men, so mimela, it has to be, for sure, that they're talking about a woman-only funeral. Well, there aren't that many funerals that are women-only funerals. That's not the way funerals are set up. Whether a man dies or a woman dies, there tends to be men and women at the funeral. So if the Mishnah says women were singing, presumably there were men who were hearing it. But Elamai, when there weren't hirhurim, so there was no particular issur of Kol Isha. So we are stricter today. There is no question. We're stricter today because we're more pirates today. Yeah.
How do we understand? So I know with Targum Onkelos, I've heard the idea that it's Mina Shamayim. The translation is Mina Shamayim, so it has a pure element to it. But at the same time, most translations that we see lose some sort of element that was created, that it was from this original thing they translated from. So how do you understand this idea that this translation was Mina Shamayim and seemingly was a very good thing that it was translated?
Yeah, so first of all, you have to understand something, because I think people have a misunderstanding. The Gemara does say that the Targum Onkelos is Nemra L'Moshe Misinai. There is such a lashon. Targum Onkelos is Nemra L'Moshe Misinai. So some people think that that's the same thing as a halacha L'Moshe Misinai, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Moshe this Aramaic translation that was handed down for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, so what did Onkelos do exactly? He just wrote down something. It's never pashut that Onkelos is the author of Targum Onkelos. Onkelos wrote Targum Onkelos. He used his Aramaic vocabulary. When Chazal say it was Nemral Misinai, what it's saying is his translation is so accurate that he is giving you the meaning of the words that Hashem gave Moshe Misinai. Not that Hashem gave Moshe the Aramaic words. Rather, Onkelos is telling you what the Hebrew means in the way that Hashem intended it when he gave it to Moshe. That's an important point, because I've heard a lot of people say, Onkelos, because again, it makes no sense. I mean, so what did Onkelos do? It's not much if all Onkelos did was write down what Halachah Moshe Misinai. So that's one thing. So in that sense, Onkelos is very pure, in that his Havana of the Torah is a very, very accurate Havana, and that gives it a very great chashivas. Of course, Onkelos was a ger, right? You know that Onkelos was the nephew of one of the Roman emperors, and in fact, his life was in danger when he converted to Judaism. But he was Meiser Nefesh to do it. Now, Onkelos has been neglected. It's a funny thing. The tachlis of Onkelos was to enable people who didn't know Hebrew to know what the Torah is saying, right? That's Targum. Now, today it's the opposite. More of us, we know our Hebrew better than our Aramaic. So instead of, I look at Onkelos to know what the Hebrew means, it's the other way around. I look at the Hebrew to figure out what Onkelos means and the like. So Onkelos has not been studied. Even people who do Shnai Mikra V'Echad Targum with Onkelos, and many people don't, because there is a svara you can be Yaitse with Art Scroll, because that's the modern day translation or the like. But even people who do Shnai Mikra V'Echad Targum very rarely study Onkelos. They very rarely see what's the chiddush of Onkelos. But Baruch Hashem, there are, number one, in Hebrew, people don't realize this, there are a number of svarim that are ma'ayin in Onkelos and telling you the chiddush of Onkelos. And now in English as well. I think Art Scroll has now an Onkelos, an elucidated Onkelos as well. So it's kedai to learn that a little bit. Maybe not pasuk by pasuk, that would be too long, but to at least selectively look at Onkelos and what is Onkelos adding to the pasuk, etc. Yeah. Okay.
Before my question, just you make the Yam Hagadol bracha on the Pacific Ocean.
Say again.
On the Pacific Ocean, you make Yam Hagadol.
Yeah, we do not. Now, in truth, once again, if we don't make it on the Atlantic, we don't make it on the Pacific. But we do not. We do not. Well, it seems to be, it's an interesting question. We make it the Straits of Gibraltar, because where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, that's considered to be...
Not the Indian or the Antarctic?
Right, so it wouldn't be any of those things. Somebody sent me once a whole list. You'd be amazed how many bodies of water are called sea of something. It was crazy. Sea of this and sea of that and sea of that. They gave me a checklist of 35 places. Do you make a bracha on these places? And by and large, the answer is no. The Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, but there's lots more obscure seas that you may never have heard of. Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so Hashem created the world, I believe, as a vehicle to give as much good goodness as possible to people. And the greatest
Yeah.
good is feeling close to Hashem. And we achieve that through Torah and mitzvahs and chesed and everything that Jews do. So, if that's the way to get close to Hashem, and if Hashem, his goal is to get close to him, and he gave us some of his goodness, why didn't he make the whole world Jewish?
It is a good question. Like, why isn't everybody a Jew? That way, everybody would have the maximum opportunity for closeness to God. That's a very good question. I mean, the truth is, this answer will not satisfy you. But the Rambam says that certain questions we can't really ask. Now, I'm not comparing a non-Jew to an animal. I'm not thinking at all. But it's the same type of question. Like, why did God make certain life forms animals instead of people? Since people are so much, well, we think people are so much better. Some people say not that case, but okay. So it's kind of unanswerable that Kabbalistically every soul has a different source in God's infinity. And some are from a different level, and therefore they find their expression in different levels. The concept is that in some way, there is kind of a cosmic body. This is called Adam Kadmai, meaning God doesn't have a body, but there's like a spiritual representation of a body. And neshamos come from that spiritual configuration of head, arms, legs. So some neshamos come from the brain, and some neshamos come from the eyes, and some neshamos come from the fingernails, and some neshamos come from the toes. And therefore, depending on where your neshama comes from, will be the configuration of its spiritual essence. So really, you're asking a question that is one of the deepest mysteries of Kabbalah. That is the notion of neshamos being rooted in what's called the primeval man. Again, this is not a body, but this spiritual, Platonic representation of the human form from which neshamos emanate. So at that point, there are neshamas that come from the toes, and they will not be capable of the neshamas that come from the head. But having said that, do remember that we do believe that a non-Jew who keeps the 7 commandments of Noach does have a share in Olam Haba. They do have paradise. They do have that connection to God. It probably will not be the same level as a Jew, but there is a great, great connection. And it's not even a sense of deprivation because they're getting as much as they could get. So there's no sense of, being shortchanged in any sense. They're getting what they're able to get, see? So that's not a chisaron.
And when you said about fingernails or toes or whatever,
Yeah.
does that refer to individuals or groups of people?
It refers to both. It refers to individuals, it refers to nations, it refers to your particular place, right? Because the problem is it's like a, what do they call it? Like a hologram. Each part also has the hole in it. So the fingernail has the whole organism with its own fingernail. So there's the fingernail over the fingernail, there's the head within the fingernail, and the like. So it gets subdivided and subdivided repeatedly. Yeah, well, same with me. Yeah, do you say?
Maybe this question's already been asked another time,
Yeah.
As maybe you've heard, or maybe not, in some more inventive streams of Judaism, they often say that the Talmud talks about there's like 8 or something genders of Judaism, kind of related to the question of like, what is a woman? So they'll say that in Talmud it talks about 8 different genders, and the question is like, what are they even talking about?
No, it is true that the issue of bisexuality, I mean, there are multiple genders in the halachic system, but they are based on anatomical and biological features. They are not based on self-identification. So, for example, androgyny is a very, very big sugya in the Talmud, in which many halachas turn on what is the status of a person that has male and female genitalia. And we have to know the status. And there are many Mishnayos and many Gemaras that discuss, is it a man, is it a woman, is it a separate gender? So there is no question that there's a great deal of discussion about that. But that's a very far afield from the argument that gender is an artificial construct. I mean, Chazal based gender discussions on discernible and identifiable biological and physical characteristics. Yeah, but you're right. If you're asking me, is there a discussion of hermaphrodites in the Talmud? There absolutely is. But that's what it's talking about. It's nothing to do with what's going on today with gender dysphoria. Yeah.
How do we deal with Kabbalah nowadays? Why do we accept it as a whole? We put it into halacha and a lot of our stuff, and it seems a lot of times the Tzoyser Gemaras and the initial text.
Yeah. The role of Kabbalah in Judaism is actually a very, very interesting one. Rav Aryeh Kaplan, I think, was one of the first who commented on it in a public way. When he translated the Derech Hashem, he did the first translation of Derech Hashem. He wrote about the idea that Derech Hashem was an attempt to present Jewish philosophy in light of Kabbalistic ideas, because that's what Derech Hashem actually is. It's not a Kabbalistic work per se, it's a philosophical work, but it's a philosophical work based on the idea of Kabbalah. So he said the following, he said, if those who have read the Rambam or other Svarim find this unfamiliar, That is because the Rambam had a philosophical view that was not connected to the Ari's Kabbalah, and the Ramchal's view was connected. And he made the point that Kabbalah has now become mainstream, which is very interesting. Very few of us learn Kabbalah. Almost none of us understand Kabbalah. And all of that's true. But Judaism, as practiced, is largely based on Kabbalistic frameworks. Whether you know it or don't know it, the fact that you wash your hands 3 times in the morning is not from the Gemara. I mean, the Gemara says you have to wash your hands, but not 3 times. That's totally Kabbalistic and the like. So many things. So the question is, why did Kabbalah kind of win? Why did it overcome everything? Why can't I go back to the Rambam, pure rationalism? And you are correct that the theology of Kabbalah creates certain religious problems. For example, Kabbalah talks about the 10 spheros. Now, the 10 spheros, if you improperly understand it, imply that God is divided into different bits and pieces. And many have said that's a stira to the unity of Hashem. That's indivisible, right? A problem. So there are those that have even said Kabbalah is apikorsis. There are those that have said that. And they have some tinus, at least if you don't understand Kabbalah correctly. But I think from our perspective, the reason why Kabbalah became so dominant is because of the great people who have adopted it. Great people in halacha, primarily the Vilna Gaon, whose greatness in halacha is beyond doubt, adopted completely, based on his own interpretations, granted, the worldview of Kabbalah, the Ramchal, Rav Chaim Volozhiner, who of course is the Vilna Gaon, but Vilna Gaon's Talmud, etc. So essentially, I think it became mainstreamed in Klal Yisrael through the Gedalim of Halacha, who saw this as the road to emes. And once they're makabel, so we are kind of mevatel ourselves to their das. But it is an interesting issue. It wasn't so pashut that this would have been the mainstream of Judaism. And of course, the other way it got in is through Hasidus. Hasidus Badafka gravitated towards the Arizal's Kabbalah, and as more and more Yidden became Hasidim, more and more got into Kabbalah. And then, of course, you have Sephardim as well. The Eidot HaMizrach, except for the Teimanim, a group of Teimanim who reject the Zohar to this day. But many Eidot HaMizrach became great Mekubalim. And that's how Kabbalah got in, the Ben Ish Chai, etc. So basically, it had to get in through the Gedalim of Halacha, who saw it as legitimate. Had you not had the Gedalim of Halacha bringing it in, it would not have come in. Yeah.
Oftentimes, Baalei Tshuva didn't know Hebrew coming into their Jewish identity, and so when it comes to tefillah or even slichos, actually more specifically, it's kind of more timely. They can't finish it along with the tzibur, or they're not saying everything. Are they missing out on certain forgiveness capacity or certain tefillah capacity? Same thing with tachanun or anything that we're like, it seems like, if I didn't say the whole thing, now I'm going to not be able to catch up.
Yeah. So let me first talk about slichos and kinos, which I think the answer is much easier. When you talk about slichos and kinos, there is no chiyuv to say it word for word. If you only said half of the slichos, that is fine. If you only said a quarter of the kinos, that's fine. I mean, let's consider what we do on Tisha B'Av. There are 45 kinos. We do between 15 and 16, depending on whatever, less than 20. So we do less than half. Am I guilty? Do I feel guilty? Well, I feel bad because there is stuff to learn and cover in all of the kinos. But you're not, rest assured, you're not transgressing anything. This is what Chazal say, Tov ma'at b'kavana. It is better to say a little with kavana than harbe, than a lot without kavana. So kinos and slichos, I would not worry about it at all, other than I would try, this is something that's important, I would try that when they say the Yud Gimel Midos of Rachamim, I should stop wherever I am and say the Yud Gimel Midos with the tzibur. But that's it. And the rest, I go at my own pace, and if I didn't finish, I don't have to finish. Okay? That's very pashut. Now, it gets a little more tricky when we talk about things that are part of the Seder of davening, where every single thing is a chiyuv, so to speak, right? Tachanan. So here, the pashtus is you normally, I would have said you have to say everything. But I heard a precedent from Rav Shechter, and I was frankly very surprised, but I heard Rav Shechter say it myself, that he said he also has problems, even he, right, even Rosh Hashiva, he has problems with finishing the long Vahu Racham on Monday and Thursday. He can't finish it with the tzibor. So he says every other paragraph, and he alternates, meaning one Monday he may say 1, 3, 5, 7, and the others is 2, 4, 6, 8. Now, I was pretty surprised because essentially what this Rosh Hashiva is saying is he skips something that's an official part of davening. But what I learned from him is that apparently that's okay too. Now, you have to know there are boundaries for that. Certainly, you can't skip Birchos Kriya Shema, you can't skip part of Shema, you can't skip part of Shmona Esrei. There are things you got to say in full, but maybe some of the extra things of Monday and Thursday, it's shaykh to be a little more liberal on. Because because these are, and the reason is like this, because in a sense, even though it's part of the davening, it's what we call tachanunim. Tachanunim are extra supplications. Selichos are like them, kinos are like them, and even v'hu racham is like them. So whenever we say this is a time to be marbe b'tachanunim, marbe in tachanunim, that means there's a certain liberality. We're not talking about word for word for word for word. You're marbe, you're saying extra tachanunim. So what you say is what you say, and what you didn't say is what you didn't say. But again, you have to be careful. There are parts of davening where there's no way you can skip. And the truth is, whatever you're missing by not saying everything, I think you're more than making up by having kavanah. The kavanah is ultimately the most important thing. Yeah.
Two-part question. First is, it seems pretty difficult to relate specifically to Korban Abayit if we haven't really experienced what it means to have these things. I do understand like the tragedy that goes down in Israel, and that's something that we can relate to. But specifically in regards to Korban Abayit, how are we supposed to relate to it and appreciate it if we've never experienced it? That's A. And B is that the question many also ask the same question. My question is that if the Beis wasn't built for in like previous generations where there was obviously a much higher level of holiness and a lot of greater leaders than we have now, so why would we be fortunate enough to see the
Right. So let me address the second question first, and that is, we assume niskatnu haderis. We assume the generations are spiritually weaker as we go on. So the question becomes, if the earlier generations of tzaddikim could not bring the Beis Hamikdash, bring the Geula, how is it shaykh for us to bring the Geula if we're worse than them? So on that, there are two answers, basically. Answer number one is, it's not that we bring the Geula, we are just the final stone. Meaning, imagine, in order to bring the Geula, you have to climb a wall, and the wall is 1,000 feet high. And all of those earlier generations already put 999. So I'm not bringing the whole Geula, I'm just doing the last 2 inches. And that I'm able to do, we're able to do. Because we're building, we're like the old mashal, a midget on the shoulders of a giant can go see further than the giant, but only because he's standing on the giant's shoulders. That's answer number one. Answer number two is from the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim says that it's true that we are a weaker generation, but precisely because of our weakness, the mitzvahs that we do might be more beloved to Hashem, because they're so hard for us to do. And Hashem handicaps us. It's like, for example, let's imagine you have a marathon race, right? So a good runner can run a marathon, I don't know, how many hours? 4 hours? Was it 2 hours? 2 hours. That's pretty good. And then you have somebody on crutches, right? Or on a wheelchair, and they do a marathon in 15 hours or something. But, they're going to get a lot of attention. Wow, you finished the marathon, 15 hours, how great it is. In a sense, we're like the person on crutches. We're the person with broken legs. Of course, what we accomplish is nothing compared to what they accomplished, but it's so much harder for us. And therefore, our mitzvahs have a special zechus that maybe the earlier generations did not fully have. In terms of feeling the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, that's a very, very difficult issue. How do you how do you miss something that you never had? If a person is blind from birth, how do you explain color to them? How do you explain music to somebody who was born deaf? The generation that experienced the Churban knew what they lost, and that's why they were so grief-stricken. They didn't want to eat meat. They didn't want to drink wine. They couldn't get over it. Their lives were shattered. With us, it's exactly the opposite problem. What is the problem? What is it that I am missing? So somebody went to the Sfas Emes, and they said, Rebbe, what do I do if I can't cry over the Beis HaMikdash? So the Sfas Emes says, cry over the Churban of your neshama that cannot cry over the Beis HaMikdash. That I can... They tell it's actually a famous story. It's a famous Israeli story. It's like part of the Israeli culture. In the Six-Day War, in June 1967, when the old city, when Yerushalmi was liberated, the coastal was liberated, right? So people are going to the coastal for the first time in 19 years, since 1948. They're going to the coastal. And almost the first group that got there were religious soldiers, the Hester Yeshiva. And they're crying and they're praying, and Rav Goren, who is a dramatic fellow, comes with the shofar blowing to announce Mashiach, whatever. Okay, that's a separate issue. But there was a Chiloni soldier who was watching these religious soldiers, and the Chiloni started crying. And his friend said to him, what are you crying about? I mean, these guys think this was the temple, a big deal. You don't believe in the temple. You don't believe in anything. What are you crying about? So the person said, I'm crying because I don't know why they're crying. And that hurts me, that I don't know. And the truth is, that's actually a machshava, I think, that we can think about on Tisha B'Av itself. I can cry because I don't know what it is that I'm supposed to be crying for. And I feel lost. I don't even understand. But one thing you got to remember, you're not mourning the destruction of a pretty building. It's not like, oh, we had that great building and that building isn't here anymore. Okay, we have other nice buildings. Okay, maybe nicer, the Taj Mahal, I don't know, whatever. Even in Yerushalayim, Bells looks kind of like the Beis HaMikdash a little bit, right? So we have a nice building. Okay, it's not that, we lost the building. The building was symbolic of Hashem's Shekhinah, the connection with God. Now, of course, God is still with us. He takes care of us. He sustains us. Of course, that's the case. But there's been a distancing. We've been separating. And that's something that can cause us pain and suffering. And through the suffering of the 9th of Av, we can be Zeicha to the Geula that way. So, just what do you think about it? Yeah.
When we say Shema, we cover our eyes. The Ashkenazim will do something like this, and Sephardim will do something more like this. Where do we get that from? And where do we do it?
That's an interesting point. I don't know, actually. I have to think about this. The Sephardim put their fingers in their eyes. That's what they do? What do they do again? Oh, I see. They put it on their forehead. For sure it's connected to Kabbalah, but I'll try to check as to why. By the way, let me just give you a little short for it. The Zohar talks about why you cover your eyes for Shema. It says a very interesting thing. Because Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hashem is Midah of Rachamim. Elokeinu is the Midah of Din. In this world, we see Hashem in two ways. Sometimes I see Rachamim, sometimes I see Din, but Hashem Echad. Ultimately, the Rachamim and the Din are united, that it's all an expression of Rachamim that branches out. Covering your eyes is a reminder that what I see in reality is not true. I cover my eyes as if to say, I'm really blind. I see Rachamim and Din. I don't see the Achdus of Rachamim and Din. And that's why I cover my eyes. So covering the eyes, the Zohar says, is the Raza de Kriya Shema. It is the secret meaning of Shema, that we live in an Alma de Peruda. We live in a world of separation, a world of dichotomy, when in fact, ultimately, everything is united. Yeah.
Here's a sentence. Kesubos is the current Masechta in Daf Yomi cycle. A lot of the material discussed is about rape and other material that some might find disturbing. Can the Rav share some advice on how to approach this Masechta with the right perspective? Alternatively, if learning this Masechta will bother or discourage someone every day, is it better to just learn something else?
I'll tell you an interesting thing. This was not a decision I made or I was involved in, but Maseches Kesuvos, except for the Kollel, was never part of the Or Sameach curriculum. In other words, if you look at the Masechtos that Or Sameach does, Kesuvos was not part of our curriculum, which is very unusual on some level because Kesuvos is actually called Shas Katan, the miniature Shas, because Kesuvos has the most proliferation of sugyas on Rov and Chazaka, like major concepts are in Kesuvos. So I was really amazed. How come you don't go Kesuvos? How do you not do Kesuvos here? So somebody told me, I never spoke to him about it personally, that this was Rav Weinbach, Zechrono Livracha. He made a decision, which is kind of what you're talking about, that because Kesuvos is so graphic in terms of sexual violations in various ways, he felt that our student body, who may have come from a world of that type of stuff, maybe they need to move away from it a little bit and concentrate on wild oxen and donkeys instead of rape and the like, and that's why there was more of an emphasis on Bava Kama. So it's interesting that the reason it makes me think of it, because what the questioner is raising is really kind of what Rav Weinbach actually felt. Again, I don't know if that would have been my decision, but whatever it is, I think Ad Hayom Hazeh, the official yeshiva cycle does not include Kesuvos, I believe. The Kollel did Kesuvos. So there are different approaches here. One approach is Rabbi Yashiv's approach. Rabbi Yashiv's approach is, if it's Torah, it's never going to hurt you. Torah is only going to help you. In fact, he even said with children, you can learn halakim of Torah that are sexual, but if it's Torah, it's going to be good. But Lamaisa, I would say, that if the person actually does feel nervous, anxious, outraged about some of these things, then maybe it's better to learn something else, meaning he may not be able to take it in at this point. God willing, he'll come to it eventually, because everything in Torah is good, but you have to be sensitive to where you're holding. Now, in terms of the general idea, how do you approach these issues? So here, I will admit to you that anti-Semites do quite a lot of damage with these Gemaras. For example, the Gemara often talks about having intercourse with a girl below the age of 3. There are different halachos that are connected to that. Well, rest assured, there are anti-Semitic. They must know Shas really well. I'm jealous of these anti-Semites. They seem to know like every Gemara about these things. But they unearth every reference, and they talk about, the Talmud is full of pedophilia, and the Talmud is full of incest, and the Talmud is full of all of these things. You see what a perverted religion Judaism is. Now, that may be what your friend is feeling, but that is incorrect, because you have to understand the nature of learning. The nature of learning is we want to understand something. And in order to understand something, we have to use hypotheticals. And through hypotheticals, we understand how a given law applies and how it doesn't apply. The hypothetical might be outrageous. It might be crazy. It might be, inhumane even. But we're not discussing behavior of actual people. We are making up unusual cases because we want to understand something. Lahavdil, I taught law school for many years. That's what we do in Lahavdil in a law school class. We'll make up crazy situations because that's how people learn things. I understand a concept by seeing how it applies in different situations. So I think part of the mistake people make is they assume that all of these questions that the Gemara discusses are questions that actually happened. Girls, got married under 3, or girls were raped under 3. We assume, first of all, maybe the Goyim did do that. That is possible. But certainly in a Yiddish society, that was not done. It was never done. Elamai, we want to understand the yisaidus of a basula, not a basula. So part of it is not to take it so personally, because this is an analytical way of understanding concepts, and it is not referring to behaviors as actually practiced. I think that's an important point. But if it really bothers the person, it shakes them up, then okay, learn something else. Baruch Hashem, there's enough in Torah that can keep you busy. Even on Tisha B'Av, people say, on Tisha B'Av, you're not allowed to learn. What am I going to do on Tisha B'Av? I can't learn. Well, there's plenty. Even on Tisha B'Av, there's plenty you can learn. And you should take advantage. In fact, the Har HaCarmel even says he was very, very upset that since people couldn't learn on Tisha B'Av, they would spend the whole afternoon talking. He says, if Chazal would say, oh, what should I do? Should I learn Torah or just schmooze the whole afternoon? He says, they would have mutar Talmud Torah. They wouldn't have mutar Talmud Torah at all. The concept is not, oh, instead of learning, I should just sit and schmooze. No, I mean, instead of learning regular, you learn the stuff about Tisha B'Av, Hilchos Avelos, Eicha, Iyov, plenty to learn. Yeah.
So the Gemara often, I've heard it spoken that the idea that like Torah is like the refuah for everything, meaning like you have a headache, you learn Torah, you do this, you learn Torah. So how does that work with the Rambam's idea that you need other outlets that are, so to speak, outside of Torah to heal you or give you a relaxation that you described?
Yeah, it's a good question, meaning there are Mamari Chazal that seem to suggest that Torah is the refuah for everything, and yet we find both in the Rambam and in the Vilna Gaon himself. Remember the Vilna Gaon said this famous teaching, I think I said it to you, that Torah is like water, just like water, whatever is in the ground, the water causes it to grow. If it's good stuff, you'll get flowers, and if it's bad stuff, you get weeds. The Torah will bring out bad midos, not just good midos. So you have to work on the weeds, get rid of the weeds, and then learn, which implies, in other words, Torah alone is not going to help. So it's hard to shtim, it's hard to reconcile it with all of the Lashonos, but the idea is that Torah is the thing that maintains, when it says refuah, it means it keeps you healthy. It keeps you healthy, not that it cures every illness, but refuah here means it preserves your health, but you may have to work on your health not to be sick, right? A chayli hanefesh. And the way we explain it is because, as the Rambam says, that bad midos are like mechitzos. Bad midos are blockages. And therefore the light, just like, you can have a digestive system that cannot absorb certain nutrients. So the Torah is the food of your neshama. But if your midos are bad, you have a spiritual digestive system that can't absorb the light. So it's not going to do anything. It's like it passes through your intestines without getting into your body, right? So that would be the analogy to bad midos. Yeah.
So I've heard you often sometimes say about, let's say, like Rav Kook regarding Hetzer Mechira, or some other rabbis regarding like Yom Ha'atzmaut or whatever, will say, you said like some people suggest, if they were alive today, they would never have would never have allowed this,
right,
or would never have given this, or
yeah,
would never have let it go on to the extent
right,
it goes on.
Yeah.
However, we like a lot of times in Chazal, like they made a gzera so and so, which has no application, like it just is not shaykh today. But we never suggest, if they were alive today, they would definitely not have this enforced. It seems like we're treating like the Achronim on a higher level, like, they're so logical, the Chazal, Chas v'Shalom, are illogical, and they wouldn't go back on their word if we don't suggest this at all.
But I tell you, you can look at it exactly the opposite way. You could say fakert. We have so much respect for Chazal that we're kind of stuck with what they say, no matter what our logic is. When it comes to Achronim, we say, if logically I shouldn't apply. I mean, you could say the other way around, that there's a greater deference to what Chazal did than we show to Achronim. With Achronim, we're willing to say times are different and the like. But there's another distinction too, and this is a relatively simple idea, between Chumrah and Kula, meaning like this. If Chazal asser something, I'm not able to say on my own, well, today the conditions are different, so let's matter it. But in the examples you gave, it really was the other way around. They permitted something, Hetzer Mechira. Now there, I think we do have more latitude to say, they permitted it based on a certain basis, it may not apply today. In other words, it's easier in a sense to be machmir, keneged a prior authority, than it might be to be makel against a prior authority. But as I say, I think Chazal are also different than Achronim. And I would also say, though, even in Chazal, let me give you one example. The Mishnah says in Maseches Terumos that you're not allowed to drink liquids that were left uncovered without supervision, even for a short time. According to the Mishnah, if I had a glass of water and nobody was in the room for even 2 minutes, I come in, I'm not allowed to drink that water because there was a fear that maybe there was some snake that came out of the wall, took a sip and put some venom in the water, and it might be poisonous. This is called giloi, right? You got to cover up liquids. So many poskim say that in a place where snakes tend not to come out of walls, you don't have to be choshesh. In other words, Chazal made a takana for particular circumstances, and that can change also. That can change. The Vilna Gaon took the other position. The Vilna Gaon said, if the Chachamim made a takana for whatever reason, you must follow it no matter what you think the conditions are. So the truth is, you can write a book, and there are books, there are svarim on it. When is it legitimate to say, oh, the reason doesn't apply, so the halacha changes? And when do you go with the idea, once they make a rule, we got to follow it? I mean, that's really the fundamental issue of your question. Because the problem is, sometimes we use one type of svara, and sometimes we use the opposite type of svara. And the question is, what exactly is the consistency? So, it is a good question. Yeah.
Here's a send-in. Rashi in Moed Katon explains the practice of the Beis Din placing a stone on someone's coffin as a zecher ba'alma of stoning someone who died while excommunicated.
Yeah.
If so, why do we place stones on graves today?
The truth is the same, the actual same reason. The idea is that the deaths, or the symbolic experience of the Arba Misas Beis Din, does create a spiritual atonement for a person. And even though today we do not administer the actual death penalty, but it's brought down that Hashem will often cause death in a certain way to mirror or mimic the Arba Misas Beis Din. So in a sense, what we're doing is we're putting a stone on a grave, according to one view, there are different shitas, in order that if the person was chayav skila for Chilul Shabbos, this should be their symbolic stoning, which would give them a spiritual atonement. So really it is connected to a spiritual atonement for someone that is may have that chayav misa. And even though skila is only one of the four, but since it's the most chamor, so the idea is by giving the most chamor, that will be a kapara for all of the other aveiros too. Yeah.
Hashem tells us in the Torah that Eretz Yisrael is a good land, but we don't trust him completely. We send him in Raglim, which is in effect a request for a guarantee of their corroboration. Avraham Avinu was told by Hashem it's a good land I'm giving you, and he asks for a guarantee. So we get punished with Raglim, but Avraham Avinu doesn't get punished if you don't count the decree of enslavement.
Well, that's a pretty big one.
Yeah, but I'm saying maybe if you don't count it because it wasn't to him, it was to his offspring.
Yeah, okay.
So why does he get a pass?
So first of all, I do want to point out one thing. The Ramban actually says that sending the Meraglim was not sinful, because even if Hashem promises you the land, you need to formulate a military strategy. So sending the Meraglim was not an Aveira. What was an Aveira was their report that we're not going to be successful. That was wrong. But to map out a strategy was actually totally legitimate. It was not an Aveira, the Ramban says. Now, in terms of Avram, the Gemara explains the following. And I'm not sure, I don't remember if Rashi says it, but the Gemara says it. That when Avram says, Hashem promises Avram the land, and Avram says, how do I know? The Gemara says he's not questioning God's promise, but he understands that God's promise may be conditional on our behavior. So he's asking God, what can I do or my children do to ensure that we don't forfeit the land by sin? And Hashem essentially showed him korbanos, the merit of korbanos, done with proper kavanah. So Bama Eda is not regarded, according to one interpretation, as a doubt in the efficacy of the divine promise. It is regarded as what can I do to be sure that we don't forfeit the gifts that you're giving us? Right? So that would take away the problem there. Yeah.
Since it was brought up too, Bob.
Yeah.
At the end of Tanit, this comes up, and it seems like all the women are portrayed as extremely superficial. We have the pretty ones are saying, "Oh, a woman's just her beauty." But the ones who have good
Look at mishpacha.
Women are just for children.
Yeah.
And the ugly ones are just saying, "Have mercy on me."
And
no
give
one's
me.
saying, well, look at me. Like nowadays, we
Right.
would say, "Look at me. Look at who I am."
He
We're
says-
just. I mean, even the whole
Yeah.
thing itself is like
I
they're just-
understand.
Yeah.
And what does
How do we explain
the
that?
less attractive say? Look at me as I'll be beautiful if you give me zehuvim. Just give me a lot of gold jewelry, and I'll look fine. yeah. It is a good question. I mean, the Mefarshim say there are deeper meanings in everything. Beautiful is defined by Eshes Chayil, right? Sheker hachein, physical beauty is false, but it's the Yiras Hashem, right? So each one of those categories could be defined in a spiritual way. So beauty can be a person's own spiritual attainments. Yichus can be the special kochos I got from my lineage, my bubby, my zaidi, different people. Ugly can mean the person who did not yet realize her madrega, but she says, there's a potential for me to do tshuva. In other words, I understand that's not the simple pshat of the words. I understand that. But at least in terms of interpretation, it is possible to read a deeper meaning into what is actually going on. But you're correct. I mean, all I can tell you is, you're 100% right, that the overall picture you get is very, very different than you might expect in a truly religious gathering. Yeah.
Here's another sentence. If creative acts are forbidden on Shabbos, malachas, why is intimacy permitted? Isn't that the most creative act?
Yeah, that's a great question, and people ask it all the time. I'm not sure if I ever came up with a real good answer to this. Right, the definition of malacha, as Rav Hirsch tells us very beautifully, is not physical work. It is the mastery of nature by creation, and since Hashem is the source of creation, we refrain from creation on Shabbos. Right, that's why simply destroying something is not a malacha. So the question is, a person creates a pregnancy on Shabbos. A person creates a life on Shabbos with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the question becomes, why is that not prohibited as an act of creation? So I'll give you a pilpulistic answer, and that is that the halacha by all malachas Shabbos is that if two people do it together, it's not a malacha d'oraisa. I thought of that just now. It's the first time I ever thought of that answer. And that is, if two people carry something, d'oraisa, it's not a malacha. So the marital intimacy, by definition, is not only shnayim sha'asu, it's shaleisha sha'asu, because we say, gimel shutfim biyadam. There are three partners in the creation of a human being, aviv, imai, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it could be that might be the teretz, the bribes shnayim or shlosha sha'asu, which is not a malacha d'oraisa. I'm sure there's a deeper answer to that, but at least al derech hapilpul, that might be a technical answer. Huh? So why didn't the Rabbanan answer it? So the answer is that they considered this, number one, the mitzvah of pru is so great, they didn't want to answer it, and also it's even considered an element of Oneg Shabbos as well, so they didn't want to make gezeros for those types of activities. However, this goes back to your earlier question about kesubas. I don't want to be marich too much, but the Gemara in kesubas discusses, are you allowed to have your first consummation with a virgin on Shabbos? Because you might be causing bleeding. There actually is a big shaila in the Gemara about a bia rishona on Shabbos. Right? So there are some elements of Chilul Shabbos connected to marital intercourse. Yeah.
And this is obviously a long time to explain, so I'm going to shorter to explain do we still get the Torah of the Olami Habo and Hashem and calls on Daka? I was just reading even just like a simple translation of the Navi, and it was very difficult to understand exactly what was going on. One message Hashem, Lo Chayil Hashem, and I guess the message that
Yeah. This is a very, very powerful parak. It's one of those prakim that even if you don't know what's going on, you get the impression that something is going on, meaning it's a powerful narrative, even if you don't know exactly what's going on. But essentially, what's happening here is the Jewish people were Ovdei Avodah Zarah. They were Ovdei Habal. Eliyahu goes up to Har HaCarmel, and there are two altars. One is for the Baal and one is for Hashem. And 400 prophets of the Baal are dancing around, and nothing happens. And Eliyahu brings a fire from heaven, and everybody does tshuva, and they bow down, and they say, Hashem hu Elokim. Wonderful. Eliyahu Hanavi brought Klal Yisrael back to tshuva shlema. And yet, Achav HaMelech tells Eliyahu the day after, I'm still going to kill you. Don't think this changes anything. What actually happens is Eliyahu Hanavi is now tzubrachin. He is now a broken man because he did his best shot. He pulled out the most dramatic Kiddush Hashem he could possibly have done, and it lasted exactly one day. And Eliyahu Hanavi says to Hashem, forget about these people. They're not worth it anymore. Forget about them. They made for your bris. They're Oved Avodah Zarah. Forget about it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to show him that you're not going to bring people to Hashem by loud, dramatic gestures, but by a quiet, gentle persuasion. And he's telling Eliyahu Hanavi, don't be surprised that some great sound and light show wasn't mashpia on them permanently. Great miracles, they remain with you a little bit, but then the reishim goes away. And that's the Kol Mamedak. It's really a lesson in how to be a manik, how to be a mashpia, how to be a leader. He then fires them, by the way. He then says, go and anoint Elisha. He says, you're finished. As the Rambam writes in Maimer Kiddush Hashem, when a manhig loses faith in Am Yisrael, he's one strike and he's out. He's no longer able to be the manhig of Am Yisrael. So that's the Kol Mamadaka. If you're interested, a person who has a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful essay on this is Rabbi Lam. I don't know if you saw Rabbi Lam's Hesber. He was talking about how the rabbinate is lonely and people don't appreciate it, but he connected it all to this story that Eliyahu was the frustrated leader, that he did the best that he could and people still didn't change. And Hashem's lesson about you have to be patient, you have to be gentle, you have to not give up. So Rabbi Lam wrote a beautiful, beautiful Hesber of that chapter. Alrighty, very good. Thank you very much. I want to wish you all, well, first of all, Bezos Hashem, we should be zeicher to the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, and I hope that all of us, if Chas v'Sholom we still have a fast on Motzei Shabbos, should at least use the time to try to bring the Beis HaMikdash into the world. And after that, the Bein Hazmanim, if Mashiach does not come, Chas v'Sholom, I hope the Bein Hazmanim should be a good time for you all. And B'Ezras Hashem, we will be mamshech in Elul. Take care. Be well.